Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time covering The Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm going to apologize for my pronunciation of Isabel's name in advance because I am bad at pronouncing a lot of things, but with the in, yeah, I think is a yeah sound. But yeah, am likely to get it wrong or forget or something. Anyway, Vampires of El Norte is a interesting blend of historical fiction and kind of supernatural stuff alongside a romance plot that's kind of um, I would say a lot of the setting is historical fiction with this kind of supernatural element. But the plot itself is very much a romance story between our two viewpoint characters, but it is largely set in the territory that is nowadays South Texas, but at the time is I guess you would say disputed. It really is the sort of territory that shouldn't be disputed because it was basically taken during the Mexican American War. But the Texans thought it should be theirs, seemingly without a whole lot of good evidence. But it's basically the strip of land. For those of you who don't know, um, in the state of Texas, there are a whole bunch of rivers that basically run from the kind of northwest down across the state into the Gulf of Mexico, ending kind of at the sort of southeast side, basically. Um, and the as you go sort of kind of crossing south, you cross all of these rivers. So like here in Austin, a bunch of the streets are named for all of the different rivers of Texas. Which is how in seventh grade Texas history for a geography quiz, I was desperately trying to remember all of the streets downtown to figure out what the rivers were on the map. Anyway, um, the kind of last strip is basically between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. In the book, they call it the Rio Bravo, but it's the basically the southernmost strip in if each strip of land is between two rivers of the modern day state of Texas. But like I said, at the time, in the late 1830s, early 1840s, all the way up to I think it's 1849 is most of the events of the story. That is still by many of the people who live there considered to be part of Mexico, but it won't be very soon. That's kind of a spoiler for the events that do not actually happen within the book, but are the future considerations of that. Um, but our main characters are two people who live, two young Mexican people who live in this region. Nena is a daughter of a rancher, and so she is not kind of the necessarily ancestral nobility, but does come from a fairly powerful and rich family relative to a lot of the kind of regular people. And Nestor is the young man who was her best friend as a child. And they really grew up together and then had this kind of nasty accident. And Nestor thought she had died and thought that it was his fault and flees. And that's sort of where that's basically the end of the prologue. Um, and then has come back to the ranch and found that she is not dead and is still alive, and is pissed off at him for having fled. And that's sort of the beginning of our romance plot. And alongside that is a kind of the historical fiction plot that is all of these ranches are gathering up all of their vaqueros, and they're becoming essentially a militia to help support the main Mexican military forces that are trying to push up to protect this strip of land, basically, from the encroaching American and Texan forces. And so that takes us to a fairly far through the story, and then obviously all sorts of other things are happening. There, it turns out, are vampires in here, which, to the best of my, excuse me, to the best of my knowledge, is not the case for actual history. But the vampires are kind of an interesting added element. And Isabel Cañas has an afterword where she talks about the kind of inspiration for this book that is really interesting, talking about her own historical research into the period and looking at primary sources talking about this sort of period of history in this region of history, and the sort of inspiration for vampires being a part of this story, which I thought was really interesting. The vampires themselves, I kind of wish, I don't know, this is an odd one because I think that they are an important part in terms of the events, but that they feel a little unnecessary in the sense that the to me the kind of historical fiction side of this story is probably the most engaging part. The romance side is, I think, seemingly fairly well done, although it's a little predictable, I guess you might say. In particular, I mean, it's an odd thing of having once been, a whole lot younger than I am now, and understanding kind of what the romantic miscommunication is like when you're younger versus now. I don't think it is unrealistic by any means for the characters to not be very good at communicating with each other, and maybe have some issues getting at kind of how they actually feel and communicating that to the other person in the relationship, things like that. But it does feel like kind of a predictable set of difficulties for a romance story to have, I guess. I don't know necessarily. I don't think it necessarily takes it away. But I'm also not really much of a romance reader, to be honest. Um, that being said, the historical fiction details, the kind of details about like the nature of this world, the kind of class issues that these characters are going through, the sort of nationalism issues that these characters are confronting, and a lot of the kind of, for lack of a better term, texture of this particular environment at this time, I thought was really interesting. And the supernatural vampires part is, to me, kind of a little underdone, which is fine, I guess. I don't know. I guess part of it is that I really think vampires are interesting when they are kind of predatory in a human sense. This idea of the vampire as this sort of charismatic figure in particular who is basically like Hannibal Lecter, for lack of a better term. And that these vampires are not as much like that, and that's unfortunate, to me at least, because I really like that kind of vampire. But that's, I don't know how much that necessarily matters. I think this is kind of a cohesive thing that is good and worth reading. And my expectations were just a little different than what this book turned out to be, which is not a bad thing necessarily. But I did not expect it to be quite as much historical romance. So, and that's just not what I read a whole lot of. So, Um, but I do think, like I said, that the historical fiction side of this book is really well done. I think in the afterword, Isabel Cañas talks about doing PhD work for a PhD in history, and that really shows, not in the sense of like being an academic who is totally kind of wrapped up in the academic side, but in having a real familiarity with this period and the material, and conveying what life was like for people here, which is really cool. And I would say perhaps the biggest reason for my tastes in reading to check out this particular book, which I think is probably worth checking out because I thought it was pretty good. Um, anyway, I guess that is perhaps the place to leave that. I think Isabel Cañas has written a couple of other kind of historical fiction horror stories. And I guess that's the other thing to say is that I liked this one definitely enough to check those out. So at some point, I will probably read. I think she has two or three others that are kind of a similar blending of period historical fiction and supernatural horror elements and all that sort of stuff. And that sounds cool. Even if I felt like it was a little underdone here, I would totally read more of her stuff. So that's I think a strong enough recommendation to check out at least this one itself. Um, anyway, I think that's going to be it for today. Vampires of El Norte. It's 300 something pages, maybe 350 or so. So not too long and totally worth checking out if a lot of the kind of material and especially if the setting sounds really interesting to you. It is a interesting perspective on a particularly tumultuous period of history in a lot of ways. So anyway, that's going to be that for me for today. So if you've read this one or any similar books or anything like that that you want to talk about, leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.